In this video, I'm going to go over Carl Jung's conception of what he called the introverted irrational types. So in Jung's typology, there's a distinction between the introvert and the extrovert. So let's kind of go over that part of the equation, and then we'll get on to the irrational side of this type. So introvert and extrovert. So when we're talking about introversion or extroversion, we're talking about your relation to the object or subject, or your relation to the objective world or the subjective world. So if you're extroverted, you're more influenced by the external world around you, right? You have a tie to the object. You are adapted to the external world. Whereas if you're introverted, you're adapted to the internal world, to the subjective factor. You have a tie or a relation to the subjective factor, and you're more influenced by the subjective factor. And so no one is a complete, introvert or a pure introvert or pure extrovert. Obviously introverts still walk around in the world, right? So they have a certain relation to the external world, but they are more influenced by the internal world and the introverted factor. Okay, so to dig a little bit deeper into the idea of introversion, so you can kind of understand it a little more, is that it's easy to kind of understand extroversion, okay? With our senses, we can see the world. With our eyes, we see the world around us, okay? Now, there is also what Jung calls a world within, and that's where the introvert is adapted. They've adapted themselves to the world from within. And so Jung puts it that there is matter, and then there is, namely, like a psychic aspect of matter. And so when we look within, we see inner images, these images within ourselves in the subjective factor. And so those images are another way of looking at the world. Okay, so instead of using our eyes to see what's in front of us, which are fallible because we can be deceived through illusions and other things, our senses don't always perceive what actually is all the time. With our inner world, we also perceive as well. So across evolutionary, time spans, there's been a build-up of this psychic aspect, which is our psychology, right? And so Jung puts it that some people are influenced and live by the external realities that they see, and some people are influenced and live by the internal or introverted realities that they see through our psychology. Okay, so it's about your relation to the subject or object and which one you are more influenced by. Now, let's move on to the irrational side of this equation. So it's the introverted irrational types that we're talking about, and Jung posits 4 different overall dispositions. Okay, so there's thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And so basically you are dominant in one of those areas, okay? And then whichever one you're dominant in will have a certain disposition, whether it's extroverted or introverted. So that makes 8 different dispositions, okay? So sensation and intuition are perception-orientated functions. They are means of ways of how you receive information, okay? Whereas thinking and feeling, quite understandably, are judgment based functions. That's how you make a judgment using your thinking or your feeling. Now, Jung says that the perception-orientated functions, namely intuition and sensation, they are irrational functions because you don't use them to make judgments. You don't use them to differentiate between different things. You just use them to receive or perceive information. So the introverted irrational types would be the intj, the infj, the isfj, and the istj. They would all be either dominant in introverted sensation or introverted intuition. So when we're looking at the introverted irrational types, we're looking at those dominant in those two dispositions, okay? And we're looking at the similarities between them. Obviously, we could differentiate between an introverted sensation dominant type and an introverted intuition dominant type, but we're not doing that. We're looking at what is the commonality of the introverted irrational type who are introverted but have a dominant disposition that is defined by perception rather than judgment. Okay, so if you're into Myers-Briggs, then they're the types that relate to the introverted irrational type that Jung's outlining. But I'll do some more videos as well on the differences between Myers-Briggs and Jung's original typology because it is a bit different, obviously. But for now, we just leave that in the corner. So I just think it's useful because a lot of people in the MBTI community are familiar with those terms. So that's why I think it's still useful to name them out so you know what types we're talking about here, what fall into this category of the introverted irrational type. So that's how we kind of get to the introvert. Now we know about introversion. We know about why it's called the irrational type, so introverted irrational type. Now, what characterizes these type of people? Well, Jung basically, if you understand introversion and you understand this type and how their mode of being and functioning throughout the world, you see that they actually are very focused and interested and fascinated about their subjective life. So they're focused more internally. They're not focused externally. So as they're going through life, they are very confusing people. That's what they are, because other people don't understand that a certain part of the population has this type of disposition towards life. Okay, and so they're largely misunderstood. Jung says they're misunderstood, and they are, kind of undervalued. People don't really see their value at all because they are, overestimated throughout their life because they can't communicate very well. That's one of the major pitfalls that Jung points out, that they're really bad at communicating. Now, I'm not trying to just say, if you feel bad about what I'm saying, don't feel bad because we'll get to some solutions later, I think. But for now, this is the problem with the type. This shows a major pitfall in this type of personality because they're focused on what they're perceiving, you see? See, they're not even making judgments on it. And see, in Jung's original typology, he kind of talks in psychological types. He talks more about the extreme of being dominated by your dominant disposition, and all the other functions are largely unconscious, if not completely unconscious. So the dominant disposition, namely if it's introverted sensation or introverted intuition, in this case, would dominate the personality, and the extremes of the weaknesses of that cognitive function dominating the personality will begin to show itself, okay? And so this is like extreme cases, because I know a lot of introverted irrational types. My mum is an introverted irrational type. And, you know, a lot of my best friends are introverted irrational types. So I understand them at a level of resolution that is very close to home. So I'm not trying to beat up on you guys, but basically Jung says here, they have a big problem with communication. So they're misunderstood in the world, okay? And also they misunderstand themselves. This is a big part of the problem. So I'll read a quote by Jung, open quote, "To the extent that they do not understand themselves because they very largely lack judgment, they are also powerless to understand why they are so constantly underestimated by the public. They cannot see that their efforts to be forthcoming are, as a matter of fact, of an inferior character." You see, because they're not good at the extroverted functions at all. They're horrible at them. So what they're really good at is the introverted perception. So they perceive things that other people can't really perceive, but they can't communicate what they see because they're not good at communicating at all. They're not good at the extroverted functions. And not only that, what they do see is very hard to explain. It's very hard to put to words the images and the sensations that they experience from the subjective factor. You will often find that these types find it very difficult to verbalize exactly how they feel or what they think about something or what they're even perceiving, because what they experience on the inner world is far larger than what they can communicate outwardly to other people, okay? And so, but if you get really close to them, like in a relationship with them, you'll begin to understand a little bit more about them and what they are perceiving, okay? So, but it takes time. It takes someone to really dig that deep, and most people don't, because we live in a pretty surface culture. So they're just going to be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You can't explain or show or reveal to me what you're saying. Therefore, you're just an idiot. So a lot of these people are misunderstood and underestimated. Okay, so people will think that they're not as smart or intelligent as they really are, but they really are intelligent and smart. They just have a different, disposition towards life. Why won't you speak? What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Jung basically says we should, kind of be a bit more fair on them. Considering these facts, we should be fairer on them to kind of try to understand them a little bit more. But we shouldn't just completely, let them have free reign with whoever they are, because they do need to develop a little bit, and they do need to develop the ability to communicate and try to use their words in ways where other people can understand at least somewhat what they're experiencing and, what they're perceiving, okay? So that basically, otherwise, if they don't do that, they're going to have a hard time in life. And I know a lot of people, I know a few people who are of this type, and some of them are fine, but some of them really have big issues with communication in so many ways. It's just that they're basically playing their own game. They're playing their own internal game, and they don't know how to play the game externally, and they're frustrated, and it hurts, and it's painful. It's a pain point for these people. It really is, and I'm sympathetic towards that. And so, that's part of making this video too. I really think that it's important to understand this type of person so that we can help them, but then they can also help themselves as well to understand, hey, yeah, I do find it hard to communicate a lot of the time. I do find it hard to find words to put to the images and the feelings and sensations that I have, and so that's another thing here. Jung says over here, from their lives, and not least from their greatest fault, their inability to communicate, we may understand one of the greatest errors of our civilization. That is the superstitious belief in verbal statements, the boundless overestimation of instruction by means of words and methods. See, so this is very important. That quote by Jung that I just read out is, these types find it hard to communicate. They can't verbalize what they experience. And that's partly because what they're experiencing is beyond what our culture accepts, or at least in the mainstream can see as something valuable within society. Because there are other modes of thinking. I mean, even in intelligence tests, there's spatial visual reasoning, there's mathematical reasoning, there's, like, whatever you call it, like you can see and experience, perceive in shapes and, rotate shapes and stuff like that. So there's, some people think in words, some people think in images is a basic concept to get that across, but it's more than just images. There's other ways of thinking. There's mathematical ways of thinking. There's all sorts of different non-verbal ways of thinking. And these people have adapted themselves to other ways of thinking that aren't verbal. So in that sense, they're going to experience a lot of difficulty throughout life because we live in a verbal, word-based culture. And that's the world that we live in, okay? And some people aren't really developed enough to even see outside words. They think that words is all there is. And so, but obviously if you looked into science or psychology a little bit deeper, you understand that, words isn't all that there is. There is other modes of thinking and being in the world. Now, here's another quote by Jung. From an extroverted and rationalistic standpoint, these types are indeed the most useless of men. Okay, so that's pretty harsh. That's pretty harsh. That's probably the harshest thing I've heard him say in a while. But remember, it doesn't mean that you guys are useless. It means that from the extroverted and rationalistic standpoint, that they view you guys as useless because they don't perceive the true value in what you are perceiving within your inner world. Have you got a job? You don't have a job? You're useless. Get to work. Get a job. And that's a big mistake because they're missing out on like one half of the equation, so, and that's the thing. So, and let's continue with this quote. But viewed from a higher standpoint, they are living evidence that this rich and varied world with its overflowing and intoxicating life is not purely external, but also exists within. Okay, so this inner world, we can receive lots of information from it via the intuition or via sensation. And so it's not useless. There is much that we can receive from it. And then Jung goes on to talk about how these types normally demonstrate and help the world through their actions. They kind of live out an embodiment of who they are. And as they live that out, that is how they teach other people. So they don't do it verbally, but it's the way that they live their life says something about life, and that's how we learn from them. So we're learning through basically observation, and they're acting as a model for us so that we can learn via modeling instead of learning through verbal statements and instruction, which, if you ever have a child, you'll realize that you can't just tell them what to do verbally all the time. you have to live out your life as a parent, and they will model what you do. You can't be like acting one way and saying another thing. The child is going to pick up on how you actually act. And so it's similar with these types. Now, with the introverted intuition dominant type, a lot of them are artists, and sometimes they take on a symbolic life. So they live out this kind of symbol, of who they are, and that teaches us something, And the introverted sensation type, they live out these type of patterns their daily rituals and their patterns that they live out, and that teaches us something through the way that they live, instead of just through the verbalization of something. And so this is really important, because a lot of these types really pay attention. They don't verbalize as much as other types. They don't have the inclination to verbalize. They don't want to. They're disinterested in trying to express themselves. A lot of them also are very low on enthusiasm. Now, on the big 5 scale of enthusiasm, which is in extroversion, one of the subcategories of extroversion is enthusiasm. That's on the big 5. It's a different way of viewing extroversion, and all that is different to Jung's typology. But I just thought it's interesting because I've noticed a pattern in them. And so also, this type needs encouragement. And I think this type is often very scared to put themselves out there, because when they're putting themselves out there, they're using their inferior functions. Jung says that this type, when you do kind of see an eruption come out from the introverted depths, when you see something actually rise up into extroversion, it's normally of an inferior character, because all their other functions are inferior to the dominant function. And so every time they try to put themselves out there, they're not very good at doing that. So we need to kind of try to encourage them. And a lot of these types, I've realized, if you're good at verbalizing things, if you're good at picking up an idea or a feeling and then verbalizing what that means, or verbalizing how it's relevant, they really appreciate that. That really helps them a lot. They might need to go away and process what you've said, but just that verbalization can help bring insights. It helps bring words to their inner experience. And then as you help them bring words to their inner experience, that then helps them understand their inner experience more and how it relates to the external world. You see? And so that can help them function a lot more in the world. And so I think that that's vitally important, because I've seen it with multiple people who are this type. They need people like us, to come and talk with them about what they're experiencing and try to draw it out of them and verbalize it. Now, we need to understand that there's other ways of perceiving the world, and I think it's very helpful to get their perspective when you can really understand that they're viewing the world in a completely different way, not through just words, but through images and other, visualizations and visions. That information is very valuable. And I think that that's important for us to appreciate, but also to kind of grab a hold of and try to expand our schema of how we see and perceive the world, and not let the gifts and talents that they have as people to go unnoticed or unused. We have to tap into that potential that they have. And so, I hope that this kind of does some justice to the introverted irrational type. And I'm going to continue to make videos on Jung's original typology. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.